welcome to the May session of the Daring to Learn webinar series. My name is Elena Boyd. I am an extension specialist with the UT Center for Profitable Agriculture. If this is your first time joining us for a Daring to Learn session, welcome. If you guys have joined us before, welcome back. We have Dr. Mark Morgan and Dr. Damla today with us from the UT Department of Food Science. They are going to be walking us through the current Tennessee Food Freedom Act, including any updates and clarifications. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started related to the webinar. If you guys are a Tennessee producer and you're watching this for Tennessee Agricultural Enhancement Program credit, there is going to be an evaluation survey at the end of this session for Daring to Learn. Just remember you're required to watch 5 of those 12 sessions throughout the year to get that TAUP credit. So remember that that QR code will pop up at the end of the session. If you guys have any questions as they move throughout their presentation today, feel free to pop those into the chat box. There's also a Q&A feature. If you have a question that is maybe a little more complicated and you need to kind of ask that verbally, we can even turn your microphone on. So just be mindful of that as we move throughout the session. Any questions that you guys have, feel free to ask those. But I think that covers all of our housekeeping things, and I can go ahead and turn it over to you guys. I had a slide in here kind of introducing both of you, but I figured you would do that in your own presentation, so we're going to skip that. And I will stop screen sharing and turn it over to YouTube.
All right, thanks, Elena. Well, my name is Mark Morgan, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Food Science and a professor and extension specialist. Most of my job is helping food entrepreneurs with starting their new businesses, so from the technical side. And also, we teach a lot of workshops for industry folks on food safety and manufacturing requirements and things along that lines. So today we're talking about the Tennessee Food Freedom Act. I know that the center that hosts these webinars is multi-state. So if you're from another state, you may have something very similar, or you may have something completely different. These types of what people call cottage food laws vary quite drastically across states. And most of these laws, or many of these laws, actually violate federal laws. But as long as the products are only sold within that one state, then the FDA usually doesn't concern themselves with those products. So small producers and things that are within a state, they're giving the states the flexibility to manage their own in-state commerce, interstate commerce. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of history about the Food Freedom Act just briefly. So prior to 2007, the Tennessee laws prohibited anyone from selling products that were made in their home without a permit or a license. Anything that was for sale commercially had to be done through a permitted process with the Department of Ag. In 2007 is when we sort of began what we call the cottage food laws in Tennessee. And here they use the terminology non-potentially hazardous foods. And if you're wondering what that means, those are things like baked goods, jams and jellies, and dry spices. So if you had a bunch of dry spices and you blend them together and sell that dry spice blend. Actually, drying the spices was not allowed, but if you started with dry ingredients, then that was allowed. The TDA at this time was licensing the home-based producers, and they would inspect their home kitchens or their domestic kitchens, and they actually required a training course called the domestic kitchen course that we hosted for years, and we still have on our website available. Then in 2012, the inspecting and permitting part of it became optional because they couldn't keep up with all of the home-based businesses that wanted a permit. And in fact, in 5 years later, they just stopped the permitting totally. So in 2017, they stopped that licensing and permitting. And this is really when everything that was made in a home now is unpermitted. Still use the terminology non-potentially hazardous foods. Think jams and jellies, baked goods, and dry spice blends. So foods could be made in a home kitchen at this time, or since it didn't really say it was a home kitchen law, it was just uh, an exemption from the regulations. They would allow people to make foods in a private kitchen and things like that. So they could actually make them in their home kitchen, a community kitchen, or even a commercial kitchen like a restaurant after hours or a church or school. Well, then we came up with the first Food Freedom Act, which is the first time they actually defined this term homemade food items. And they created a definition, which I'll show you in a minute. But this replaced, and then they also replaced the terminology non-potentially hazardous foods with non-TCS foods. And non-TCS strictly just means food items that do not require time and or temperature control for safety. So it still included the jams, the jellies, the baked goods, and the dry spice blends, but now it expanded it to pretty much any food that was shelf stable, didn't require refrigeration or freezing to maintain safety. So the homemade food items you'll see in a minute could not include alcoholic beverages, meat, fish, or eggs. Things with dairy, they could not sell dairy products, but they could sell foods with dairy product ingredients like milk. You could bake goods, obviously have milk in them, but you couldn't sell cheese or pasteurized milk or anything like that, or yogurt. And then in 2025 is the latest version. This is the one we want to talk about and what was changed. So this current version now allows for time and temperature controlled for safety foods. So they expanded the options to allow, they still allow the non-TCS homemade food items made at a private residence, but now they added TCS foods, things that require time and temperature control for safety. So if you think about it, this term, it really comes from the food code and it's used more in a restaurant environment. So TCS foods on a salad bar, for example, or a buffet bar would be those things that need to be kept hot to prevent bacterial growth, those things that need to be kept cold, like salads, lettuces, and cut tomatoes and fresh fruits and vegetables, and then the hot items like a pasta dish or meat or anything like that. So those TCS items are now allowed to be made in a private residence and sold within the state of Tennessee. Now there are some limitations and restrictions which we'll get to. Okay, so new changes went effect last year, July, almost a year now, and coming up on a year. And this Food Freedom Act is really an exemption from the state's food manufacturing regulations for homemade food items made in Tennessee. So the reason I point this out about food manufacturing regulations is because this is really intended to be under the guises of food manufacturing. So there's really two venues or operations where you can purchase food. There's packaged foods and things you would buy at the grocery store and take home and consume. And then there's things that you would buy at a fast food restaurant or a food truck, which are regulated by the Department of Health and are more food service items rather than food manufactured foods. So was intended to be manufactured foods and not necessarily food service items. But there's really no distinction in the regulation about the two. So they tend to overlap a little bit. Okay, so the actual code says the production and sale of homemade food items under this chapter are exempt from all licensing, permitting, inspecting, packaging, labeling laws of this state, except when the Department of Health is investigating a foodborne illness. So these highlighted in red here is a little bit misleading because the law itself, or this Food Freedom Act itself, actually has some restrictions on what items can be made and what labeling requirements there are, and built right into it. So you'll see that a little later. My colleague Damla will cover that. Here's the definition of a homemade food item. Not very detailed, but it just means a food item, including non-alcoholic beverage, which is produced and if it's packaged at the private residence of the producer. So whoever is making these homemade food items, it has to be done at your residence. It can't be at a neighbor's or anything. And the word at, I think, is important here because it doesn't say in your home kitchen, it says at your private residence. So if you had a nice kitchen facility set up in your basement or in a building next to your house, you could do that there as long as it's at your private residence, considered your private residence, and the address is the same. So that's a key distinction, I believe, that was the legislators put in there on purpose. And the reason I've heard that is because if you're familiar with making maple syrup, I understand the last place you want to make maple syrup is inside your kitchen or your home because it makes can make everything sticky and nasty. So a lot of people will do it in a shed or in a garage or some other building. All right. The other part of the is that this requires now the homemade food items to be made at the producer's private residence. So the definition of the homemade food item is what requires these products to be made at your private residence. No longer can they be done at a commercial facility or at a shared space or a church or restaurant kitchen. It has to be at your private residence because that's the definition of this homemade food item. All right. So what homemade food items can be sold? Well, this is always the question we get, and there's really only a few things that are limited in the rule itself. And so it says the TCS homemade food items must, according to the act, not include unpasteurized milk or foods that are or contain alcoholic beverages, fish, shellfish, meat byproducts, or meat food products. So I highlighted unpasteurized milk because I know this is a dairying group. So uh, none of the products can have unpasteurized milk in them or as a part of their recipe. And then, although it's missing, so I highlighted this part in italics, it's not really specifically spelled out in the rule. But since this is an add-on change from the 2022 version, we think that this same criteria applies to non-TCS foods. The 2025 version really focuses on the TCS addition, but we think that the same thing applies. The same ingredient restrictions apply for something that would be shelf stable. All right. And then it says meat, no meat or meat byproducts, but we're going to see in a minute, a few slides later, that there is actually an option to use poultry meat. So they found a loophole, let's say, to allow you to use poultry. All right. So what is this time temperature for safety or not? How do we determine whether a product is TCS or not? And we'll just explain that scenario. So a TCS food, time temperature controlled for safety, is anything that requires time or temperature control to limit the rapid growth of microorganisms or toxin that they may produce that can make someone sick. So most refrigerated and frozen items, for example, are considered TCS. We keep refrigerated, uh, and that prevents bacterial growth. Or if it's something sold hot, like on a hot food bar, then we keep it hot, so that prevents bacterial growth. And the other thing about TCS foods in the restaurant side of things is we typically consume them fairly quickly. So the product is made in that kitchen and it's sold fairly quickly. And that also is a safety measure in terms of time control because the bacteria need time to grow. So if you take that home and you leave it on your counter for several hours, then it could definitely make you sick because it's not designed to be held for that long in at room temperature. All right. If we look at non-TCS foods, these are still the ones that were allowed before, things that don't require time and temperature control to prevent bacterial growth. And and it but it doesn't mean that non-TCS foods won't spoil. If you think about bread is something that we leave on the counter all the time in the cabinet or bread box, and uh, it'll always be safe, but it may eventually mold, right? So it can spoil, and a lot of the non-TCS foods can still spoil, even though they're not potentially hazardous or not a safety concern. So shelf stable. or what we would call preserved foods, things like pickles or chow chow or pickled beets, salsa. Those things are commonly considered non-TCS. And they're considered non-TCS because they've gone through a thermal process to make them shelf stable. So anything in a jar or a can uh, is typically considered non-TCS because of the processing that it underwent. All right, how do we distinguish? Well, it turns out there's really two properties of the food that can allow the bacteria to grow or not, depending on what the values are. One of them is pH, how acidic the product is. So most foods are acidic or slightly acidic with a pH less than 7, but the lower the pH, the less likely bacteria are going to grow. And so things that are very acidic will be more likely be non-TCS. Water activity is another measure that we look at because microorganisms need moisture to be able to grow and multiply. And this water activity is a measure of how much moisture those is available for those microorganisms to use. So it ranges from 0 to 1, where something with no moisture in it at all would have a water activity of 0, and water itself would have a water activity of 1. So if something had a water activity of 0.85, you can sort of relate that to relative humidity. Something like 85% relative humidity is a product that has a water activity of 0.85. So if I seal the food in a jar and let it equilibrate with the air around it, the humidity in the air may go up to 85%. That means that the food you put in there had a water activity of 0.85. If the humidity in a jar goes down, if I put a cracker into a little jar and seal it up, it may suck up moisture from the airspace around it. So the humidity in that air may go down to something like zero point 0.3, and that's because the water activity of the cracker may be or 30%, and that would be the water activity of the cracker would be 0.3. So those two numbers are directly related, just one's divided by 100. All right. So the combination of these two properties is really how we, in terms of process authorities and evaluating products for folks, how we decide whether something is TCS or non-TCS. There's nothing preventing an individual from measuring both pH and water activity on their own. And you can buy pH meters fairly cheaply, less than $50 in many cases. Water activity meters are typically a little more expensive. And this one here I'm showing may cost $10,000, but there are some cheaper ones that are $500. Whether or not you have a big enough operation to justify that cost is up to you, but we can test it as well here. And Damla will explain that, I think. But here's how we would use two charts that are in the food code to determine whether something is TCS or not, non-TCS. So this chart is table A is for food that is heat treated and subsequently packaged. So something that's heat treated and packaged. Um, excuse me. This would be something like a barbecue sauce, maybe that's in a glass bottle. So we heat up the barbecue sauce, we put it in, fill it into a bottle hot, and we seal it up. So it's heat treated and packaged. So we would look at the pH of the barbecue sauce. Is it in this range? We look at the water activity of the barbecue sauce in this range, and we would decide that it is non-TCS. If it's over here where it says so the heat treatment process for this table needs to be something that we know is good enough to make the product shelf stable and ideally prevent spoilage, but it may still be able to spoil, especially after the container's opened. If it lies in any of these three boxes, so a pH greater than 5.6 and a water activity in this range, then this is what we would consider TCS unless it's evaluated by a process authority. So product has been assessed by some professional. But automatically you could assume that it's TCS for most part. Okay? Until proven otherwise, let's say. All right, the same thing happens in this table, same chart, only this is now for foods that are not heat treated. And a good example here may be something like mayonnaise, or maybe cheese. I don't know. Cheese may not be heat treated, or it's heat treated but not packaged. So something like a baked good or a pastry. maybe something that is baked, so it's been heated, but you're not going to put it in a hermetically sealed container. It's just going to be sold on a plate or wrapped in plastic, perhaps, which is not very tightly sealed. So again, we look at the pH range, we look at the water activity range, and we decide whether it's TCS or non-TCS. And here you can see the difference. These are all would be considered TCS over in this range. All right, so mayonnaise or pastries are good examples, something that's not heat treated or heat treated but not packaged. These are just sources that you can use for validation of the thermal process. You know, if you're canning something using a recipe that comes out of a canning guide, or you can contact the process authority to evaluate your individual product. If it's not in a book, it's your own unique recipe. Uh, Many times we can do that here, or you can pay to have somebody else do it as a process authority. So here's a table that a lot of people want to see to know, well, what products are TCS or non-TCS? And I tried to give examples of the similar products where one is TCS and one is non. So if we look at this row here where we're looking at dairy products, so hard aged cheese or butter, those would be good examples of non-TCS type items. Typically, they have low water activity for the butter for sure, and maybe low pH for the cheese. So it may be a combination of the cheese, the pH and the water activity for a cheese. But other dairy products like pasteurized milk, fresh cheeses, like queso cheeses or yogurts, those are going to be TCS because they have a higher water activity and may have a higher pH. Yogurt typically has a low pH, but it's mainly the water activity in this case. So you can find similar things across here for vegetables, canned vegetables and beans versus fresh vegetables and cooked beans. Uh, these are going to be TCS on this side, non-TCS on this side if they've been properly canned. Another one that's a lot of people are interested in is baked goods, and baked goods or pastries can be either non-TCS or TCS. Typically, the breads, cookies, and cakes are all non-TCS. The only thing that becomes an issue is the frosting or a filling. And as long as the frosting or filling has a low enough water activity, which we can test here as well for you, as long as that's less than 0.88 or something like 88% relative humidity, then it is considered non-TCS. So frostings and fillings can be put on those or in those items. And buttercream frosting is a good example. There's a lot of recipes of buttercream frosting that will meet this requirement of low enough water activity. Other ones where we put cream filling or cream cheese filling, or that filling has been put in after you baked it in particular, then we have to look at that filling to see what is its water activity. And sometimes those are much higher than 0.88. So that makes it TCS. Now you can try to lower it by adding more sugar or things that will bind the water, and that can work. But you typically have to have it tested to know whether or not you're meeting the criteria for TCS or non-TCS. Here's another one that's interesting, just because caramel or caramel is made with milk, but you know, that's usually low water activity. So you would think, well, caramel apples are non-TCS, caramel's non-TCS. So why do I make a caramel apple? And all of a sudden it becomes TCS, according to the Department of Ag. And that's because we've had issues where when a stick is inserted into the apple, it injures the apple skin and allows juice to come out. And they've had issues where bacteria was found growing around the stick of the caramel apple. And they actually had some people get sick. Some children get sick from listeria from the caramel apple sticks. I don't know if it was in Tennessee, but it was in the US for sure. Okay, so that's just an example. This is not an exhaustive example by any means, but just gives you some examples of TCS versus non-TCS products. And then the important part about TCS products is how you handle them, right? So the legislators have given you a broad range of ability to make these items, and now you have to be careful about not making someone sick by making and selling these. But these are typically foods that don't contain animal products. They don't get, or they contain animal products. They contain plant-based products that have been cooked. like beans or green beans or whatever that have just been freshly cooked and not preserved. Maybe just freshly cut fruits and vegetables in some cases. Garlic and oil mixtures are an issue. Um, the garlic itself, if it's fresh garlic, is typically TCS, and when you put it in oil, it makes it anaerobic, and there's a risk of botulism in those kind of mixtures. And then anything refrigerated or frozen, those are going to be TCS. So you're now allowed to make the many of these products. You just have to be careful about how you do it. So TCS food items have to be kept out of this danger zone, and the 41 degrees to 135 degrees. So if it's cold, you have to keep it below 41. If it needs to be refrigerated, if you're going to keep it hot, it has to be kept above 135. And then again, because this came from the food code, TCS food items, because of the time part, if they're in this danger zone, if you're not controlling the temperature, then they're supposed to be discarded within 2 to 4 hours, depending on the type of product. And so you have to think about this. If you're going to make something at home, take it to a farmer's market and sell it as a TCS food item, but you're not going to keep it refrigerated or hot, are you willing to throw it away after 2 hours, what you haven't sold? Because that's really what you should be doing to prevent people from getting sick or the risk of getting sick. All right. All right. Then there's other limitations that from the Food Freedom Act, and the general limitations are that the homemade food products must be produced at your private residence. I mentioned that before. They must be sold only within Tennessee. If you go to Kentucky or North Carolina, they have different rules, and you can't take these products across state lines. As soon as you take these kinds of products across state lines, they come under the FDA jurisdiction, and FDA may come in and shut you down if there's an issue with these products. And then they must meet the labeling requirements that Damla is going to talk about in a few minutes. The non-TCS food items can be sold essentially anywhere within the state, in person, remotely, using a website, or even through a third-party vendor. If a grocery store like an IGA or someone, a mom and pop, is willing to carry your products, then you can sell the non-TCS items that way. But the TCS items, they specifically stated in the rule that they must be sold in person, direct to consumers. So you can only sell them directly through your own farm stand or farmer's market or any other direct to consumer sale venue. And the TCS food items must be kept refrigerated, must be under temperature control. That's italicized because it's not in the rule, but that's sort of a given with TCS food items. You really must be doing temperature control or discarding them within the 2 to 4 hour range, depending on what it is. Okay, here's that exemption for poultry. And I doubt that many of you are poultry producers that have 1,000 birds in your backyard and you're slaughtering them and processing the meat yourselves. But if you were, you could use that meat in your homemade food items. Most likely you're a everyday person like myself, and you're just going to purchase poultry meat from a store. And so that poultry meat has already been inspected by the USDA, has the official mark of inspection, and you can use that meat in your homemade food items. So this is a loophole. This regulation right here is from the USDA regulations, and this is a loophole in the USDA regulations that allows food service establishments to use already inspected poultry meat in their products and not have a USDA inspector there on site. And there's only a loophole for poultry, not red meats or other meats. So the state legislators couldn't allow red meats or other meats because the USDA inspector would have to be there anytime those products were being made. But with this poultry exemption, this loophole, they could allow you to do chicken pot pies, for example, that have poultry meat that was already processed under inspection and just used in your food item, homemade food item. So that's a win for us. Many states don't have that kind of thing. So usually no meat products are allowed under these types of regulations. All right. Then this other one is gives some people heartburn, saying that the Tennessee Department of Health may require access to your home kitchen where you're making these products if someone suspects a link to a foodborne illness. And also you can't have any health claims on the product. So a lot of people want to try to make, you know, elderberry tea or elderberry syrup or something and have some health claims on there. That can also trigger FDA to get involved. Anytime a food item has a health claim on it, FDA immediately thinks they have jurisdiction, and so they'll come in and want to send you a letter to cease and desist any kind of health claims on food items that they have not reviewed. The last one here gives a lot of people also some concern, and that is that these food items are not allowed to be served or used as ingredients in a restaurant or food service establishment. So you can't sell these things to your local restaurant or use them in your own restaurant or food truck or catering service. And that is again because they have to follow the food code. And so um, the food code requires them to use ingredients that come from an inspected source. And since none of these homemade food items are made in an inspected facility, they're not allowed to be used in these types of things under the food code. So that's the reason that's still there in the regulation. It's going to be a tough one to change. But that's my part. I will turn it over to Damla and let her take over if I can
Yeah.
stop.
Thanks, Mark. And here we go. Let's go to the presentation mode. All right. Give me a second. All right. So I can see you, but I'm hoping everybody is still there with us. So far, Mark mentioned about like before continuing, actually, I want to introduce myself first. I'm Damla, Extension Assistant Professor at the University of Tennessee in the Food Science Department. And like Mark, similar to Mark, I'm helping the small food businesses, mostly in Tennessee, but everywhere in the US. We are helping them with testing their products for pH and water activity and writing them a process letters if they're making the low acid and acidified, not low acid, but acidified and acid foods, formulated acid foods. And also we are helping the Tennessee Food Freedom Act producer with testing their products for pH and water activity. And based on the table A and B that Mark went over, we write a letter saying that this is the pH and water activity and your product is non-TCS or TCS based on these tables. So we have those services as well, and we are also conducting the training, BPCS training, preventive control training, that kind of training to the food companies. So far, Mark mentioned about the, what's non-TCS, what is TCS, and what can be done, under TFFA, or what can't be done, and what is that, blah, blah, blah. So now you have the product, and you package them, and you are going to label them, and we are going to talk about what's the labeling requirement under the Tennessee Food Freedom Act. Nothing has been changed since TFFA 2022. Everything is same in terms of labeling requirements. So still, the producer information, including producer name, home address, and telephone number, must be on the label. And you put the common name, usual name of the product. If you are making, let's say, pickles, then common name for that is pickles. So you put that information on the label. And then ingredient list in descending order based on weight is you see in all of the food items that you buy from grocery market. And then the following statement must be on the label as well, saying that this product was produced at a private residence that is exempt from state licensing and inspection. This product may contain allergens. We have suggested information here for TCS foods. So like just to, tell consumer how they need to keep the products they're buying, just put something keep refrigerated, saying keep refrigerated on the label. so that they will know how to handle after they buy. We have some examples, labeling example here. On the front side, we have the common name, pickled beets, ingredient list, and then the statement saying that this product was produced at a private residence, blah, blah. On the other side, we have the contact information, producer information, name, phone number, and the address. This is the home address. This must be the home address or your private address because that is where the product was produced. Another example, but this time ingredient has sub-ingredients. The sub-ingredients are the ingredients of one of the ingredient. So let's say you have the chocolate chip cookies. The chocolate chips used in this product contains other ingredients, multiple ingredients, and those are called sub-ingredients. So on the label in ingredient list, uh, all ingredients, including the sub-ingredients, must be included. If any ingredients, like chocolate chips, has multiple ingredients, everything should be on the label. Because like some allergens, in this example, soy and milk, can be hidden in the sub-ingredients. If we don't put the sub-ingredients on the label, then the consumer would think that this is safe to consume, even though they have the, let's say, dairy allergy. Again, here we have the statement, the same statement that we have seen. More labeling example for this time for TCA food. We have chicken salad here. So the common name on the top, we have this suggested information. This is not required, but suggested information on the top. We have ingredient list, producer information, and the statement. So another example, but this time with dairy, pimento cheese. We have the common name on the top and the suggested information, ingredient list. So for cheese, we see the sub-ingredients are listed accordingly. For example, another example for mayonnaise, it contains multiple ingredients and everything is listed here. And producer contact the producer name, home address, and the phone number and the statement. There are no alternatives for any of the information required on the label. Like we know that sometimes it's not best to include your home address or your phone number on the label, but that is what this regulation wants from you. And if you don't want to have identifying personal information on the label, the other option is to become a licensed food manufacturer, then the manufacturing location is going to be included on the label instead of your home address. That is going to be your facility address then. People with food allergens need to make an educated decision about the food they buy. So they need, not require, to read the label and the ingredient list to see that product has allergens of the concern. Again, as we said, many times sub-ingredients contain allergens, and that is why the sub-ingredients must be on the label as well. And so far, the 9 major allergens in the US are milk, soy, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, eggs, wheat, and sesame. Sesame is the latest one added to the list. It's not very common, but it's something to mention. Where does this labeling information go? Those information must be on the label if packaged or sold in bulk and attached to the product or to the bulk container, whichever is the case for you, on a play card and displayed at the point of sale if product is not packaged or sold from a bulk container. This is mostly applicable for the farmers market sellers. And on the website where the product is sold, but remember, you can't sell the TCA products on the website. The only product that you can sell on the website are the non-TCS products. If product is sold by phone or custom order, then the seller must inform the consumer that the product is produced at a private residence that is exempt from state licensing and inspection. Again, this is a case for only non-TCS product because you cannot sell the TCA products over the phone. The only option for selling the TCA is direct selling. And recommended good practice for homemade food producer. Always use food grade utensils, equipment, cleaner, sanitizer, packaging materials, and ingredients. And make sure the workspace and equipment is clean and sanitized before the production. And try to exclude pets from the workspace while you are making a food that you are going to sell to someone else. We love them, but while we are working in the kitchen or at your private residence for selling the products, they can be in another room. And close bathroom, outer doors, and kitchen doors to prevent the cross contamination. So anything nasty, the microorganism could be could become from the bathroom if you don't close the doors. No evidence of pests. Nobody likes to have the pests at their home, at their private residence anyway. So we suggest using commercial pest controls if it's ever needed. Domestic kitchen training. So Mark said that this was required back in time, but it's not required anymore. But we know some private farmers market uh, uh, put that as required for their sellers. So it's outdated because the regulations have been changed. We are updating this course and it's going to be available soon. I want to say before the end of year. And that new course, the updated version of the course, is going to have three parts. In the first part, so there will be information about the food regulation and safety, uh, unless it's going to change again this year. It's going to be about the TFFA 2025. And then in the second part, the information on canning are going to be discussed. And then in the last part, third part, the business side of the home-based producer production is going to be talked. So to summary what we talk today in this presentation, we say TFFA requires products to be made at your private residence, no more commercial or community kitchens. TFFA allows both TCA and non-TCA homemade food items. Not all TCS products, but certain TCS products. Foods cannot include red meats, fish, shellfish, raw milk, or alcohol as ingredients or final products, but with that two exemption, it can include poultry products. TCA food items must be sold only in person to consumer, but non-TCA food items can be still sold via third party like grocery market or on the internet or over the phone. Specific labeling requirements still in effect. Nothing has been changed there regarding the labeling requirements. And no TFFA homemade food items used by restaurant, food trucks, or caterers because they are food service establishments and they must follow the food code. And that says they cannot use the ingredients that is not inspected. Since TFFA homemade food items are not inspected, restaurants cannot use this product as ingredients. With that, this is the end of our session today. And here you can find our contact information. If you ever have any question about the TFFA or about food safety or anything, you are always welcome to reach out to us. And we will do our best to provide you the information, the best information. We hear the codes for the website. We have Facebook as well and the LinkedIn page as well. We are sharing our publications here, or our talk, our sessions, trainings, and everything are being shared in on all of them. With that, we are going to continue with the questions.
I'm not seeing any questions in our chat box. We'll give folks just a second. Uh,
Yeah, that means everything is like either well understood or nothing has been understood, right?
all right. Oh, we just got one. It asks, what are the guidelines for fish? And if you need to screen share again, Donna, let me know and I can.
Yeah. So for fish, fish cannot be sold under TFFA 2025, and there is no guidelines for fish because you cannot sell it under TFFA. There are no more weight sizing guidelines for the label anymore. That is not a required information. It doesn't have to be on the label. But if you still want to do that, there is a special guideline. The requirements, the scale must be calibrated, blah, blah. I can share that requirements with you if you are interested, but under TFFA, that information is not required.
We also got a question in the Q&A about tallow. So this person says she
Mm.
was told that she could sell tallow lotion, but not tallow to cook. That she was registered as low risk. Her inspector told her that she would have to be registered as higher risk for cooking tallow. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So tallow is a part, it can be considered as a red meat, and red meat is, I mean, it's not meat, but it's an animal product and cannot be sold under TFFA to my understanding. As lotion, you can sell it. It's not food product, but TFFA products are for human consumption. So maybe there is no risk in terms of the applying on the skin, but as far as I know, they cannot be sold under TFFA, right, Mark?
Yeah, so she mentioned inspector, so I'm guessing she's going the commercial route. And the Department of Ag usually charges people a fee for their license based on the risk category of the item they're making.
Mm.
So if you're making something like jams and jellies that you want to sell commercially, or get a permit for, that would be a low risk category, which is a lower fee. And if you sell something that's a higher risk, like a animal or dairy product, that'll be a higher risk category. They'll charge you a higher fee. So it sounds like they're considering the tallow lotion because it's not something that people consume is a lower risk. But if you're
Mm.
selling tallow for food item, then it would be a higher risk item just because it's coming from a meat product, I would guess.
Awesome. Something new that I learned today.
While we wait just a second on any other questions, I will say we do have a Daring to Learn recording on the Sender's YouTube channel about cosmetic and soap products. So those regulations come from the FDA or the Consumer Product Safety Commission, depending on if it is a cosmetic or a bar soap. But those are all strictly like not for human consumption. And we did get two more, looks like, in the chat.
Yeah, I see the question on the chicken broth. It's asking if chicken broth canned and stable under the Food Freedom Act, or is it have to be under a food manufacturer? So this is the biggest change in the current version of the Food Freedom Act. Any product with chicken in it, or chicken bones, chicken feet, chicken meat, as long as that chicken was purchased at a grocery store already under inspection, or the person is raising their own less than 1,000 birds in their backyard and processing them. That can be done under the Food Freedom Act. It has to be sold in person. So a farmer's market would qualify that could be sold at a farmer's market direct to consumers. because it may be a TCS product. If it's non-TCS, like if it's canned, properly canned, then it would fall under the older rules of 2022 where they could sell it. They perhaps could sell it third party, I think. Um, that's not really spelled out in the rule because, again, I mentioned that they left off all the non-TCS part of the rules when they made this new edition. But I would assume that if you were allowed to sell canned vegetables before, and now you're allowed to sell things with chicken in them, you could make canned chicken soup and sell it, whether it's third party or in person. So vendors would be allowed to sell that. How do you manage it? That's a good question. I guess as long as it only has chicken and no other meats in it, then you can consider that as a Tennessee Food Freedom Act item. And just look for all of the labeling requirements. Do they have the statement that it was made at their private residence? Do they have the statement that says it was may contain allergens? That's really all you can do. Now, if you're uh, a manager of a farmer's market and the farmer's market is private, you can prevent people from selling items that you don't want in your market. So you as a farmer market manager, if it's a private market, you could say, we're not allowing anyone to sell TCS food items. But if it's a state or city or county run market, then there is something in the rule that says the state and local municipalities cannot prevent people from selling these items. And so then your hands would be tied. You would have to allow them to sell anything made under the Food Freedom Act. Okay. Well,
There is one more question mark saying that as a farm manager, oh, you replied that, right?
yeah.
Okay. I was looking for the links.
All right. Well, I hope that was helpful. And we're glad to answer any questions you may think of later on with our information. Look us up. Just Google UTK Food Science Extension and you'll find Damla and I's webpage and our contact
I'm going to share the link to our webpage
in
Oh,
the
great.
into the
chat there.
chat.
Yeah, there you go.
And in the follow-up email that I will send out to you guys after we get the recording together, I'll share their contact information, their emails, and if you guys don't care,
Yeah.
I can share a copy of these slides too,
Sure.
with folks. So we'll get that out to you guys. Um, thank you guys for sharing that information. And for those of you that are still on with us, if you guys don't have any more questions, I think that brings us to the end of our session today. Um, so be on the lookout for the follow-up email with that additional information. And if you guys have any other questions for either Mark or Damla, feel free to send those to us in an email and we can pass those along. But otherwise, we will see you guys next month. So I will stop our recording.